Hello, welcome to the stream. I'm hopping on a couple minutes early here just to make sure everything's set up and my equipment's working and I know what I'm doing here and don't end up having technical difficulties as soon as I start the stream. So, amazing. Uh, you will notice if you are watching the recording of this after the stream ends, you will notice that this is a very bare bones stream, and that is because I don't 100% know what I'm doing as far as Twitch is concerned, but I did not want that to stop me from starting the book club. So future streams, we might have like chat on the side of the screen. We might have some little special fun Twitch things, but for right now, we are in uh boomer mode. We're in unk mode. Um, okay. I think that about covers it. Let me let the internet know that I'm streaming. Onk mode, even. Honestly, very valid. I should have thought of that. I don't know why I didn't think of that. Okay, say cheese. Cheese. Oh my God, I love the pride flag. I gotta figure out emotes. That's on the to-do list. All right. The world at large has been informed that I am loose upon the internet. And it is 9:30. Um, I guess I should figure out how to see who is watching. There's got to be a setting for that. Chat, upper right corner, the two people. Hello, chat. Hello, the two people. Aha. All right. Well, it is 9:30 p.m. Central Time, which means it is time for book club. Hello and welcome. I wrote down some announcements up top because one of the main reasons that I even am doing this is because I have really poor short-term memory. And so I'll get into that. This whole thing is an experiment. I have been dealing with a bunch of like physical chronic pain, chronic illness stuff. And as a result of that, I got put on a medication that uh, does help me not be in pain all the time, but also affects my central nervous system and very specifically affects my ability to like learn new information, intake new data, and also I have found makes it extremely taxing for me to try to like read silently to myself. It's a lot easier if I can like discuss as I go. So part of this whole thing is like I really want to understand the world better and understand people better. And there's a lot of really good books that already exist. I don't have to like go reinvent the wheel and do a bunch of my own research. I can literally simply, oh my God, Izumi Curtis, you little criminal. Be in here, baby. Ugh, no. Well, now you're captive. Say hello to chat. Baby cat immediately broke into the office. Say, I love you. Out we go. She headbutts her way in. She's the best and also the worst. She's very orange. Um, okay. Back to the intro. So, my plan here is I'm gonna read out loud some books that I want to read, have thoughts about, and talk about it as I go. If people are in the chat and also want to chime in with your thoughts, I would love that. I would love a bit of like back and forth. And like if you have questions or I read something and you're like, oh my God, that like, yes, absolutely this. Here's like an anecdote. Go for it. Um, I am recording these. I plan to post them afterwards. Maybe on YouTube, maybe on my Patreon. I haven't quite figured out exactly where, but they will all be like publicly available afterwards. So if you miss a book club session, you can always catch up. Um, Starting with High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out by Amanda Ripley, which you can tell I have already read, but I read it a while ago and I have been dying to talk about it. Um, let's see. The Mods, Evolving Logic and Rarius Pringle, two of my actual real life friends, are helping mod and be nice to them, do what they say. They're good beans. They are extensions of my will. That's a crazy thing to say. Um, I'm planning to stream for at least an hour tonight, maybe 2 hours, probably not longer than that. And uh, like I said, this is an experiment, so it kind of just depends on like how physically, mentally, emotionally taxing is this? Like a tentacle, which is arguably crazier. Okay, yeah, fair. And that's why bestie vibes. Same brain cell. Um, I don't know if there's anyone in the chat except for the mods right now, but just in case there is, this is not a like candy craft crochet stream. It is specifically like a book club stream. So if you do have like candy and craft questions or things you want to say or whatever, please go say them on my Instagram or my YouTube or just wait until I am not doing this particular stream. All right, let's get into it. High Conflict by Amanda Ripley. Oh, and like if I am reading too fast, if you need me to go back and say something, articulate, enunciate more clearly, let me know. There is a lag on the chat, so like I will see what you say a bit after I am talking, so be like specific about what you need repeated. Um, yeah, I think that covers it. We'll just figure it out as we go. All right. Introduction. As a rule, Mark Linus did not enjoy upsetting people. He liked to read history books and play Ultimate Frisbee. He had a job editing a small charity network website. The son of a scientist, he was passionate about protecting the environment, but he preferred to write his arguments rather than scream them. And yet, one night in 1999, Mark found himself trespassing on a farm near his home in the east of England, dressed in all black, carrying a machete. It felt like the absolutely right thing to do to bring that machete down hard, cracking through one healthy corn stalk after another. He worked methodically, thrashing his machete up one row and down the other, taking care to avoid hitting his fellow activists. Imagine getting hit by a machete in the middle of a cornfield while you're illegally doing like eco-terrorism. Bonkers in England. Also, like cornfields in England. Not something I thought about. As someone who lives in the Midwest, it's all fucking corn out here. Anyway, yes. Taking care to avoid hitting his fellow activists. The air smelled of moist soil and freshly ruptured roots. He stopped to adjust his glasses every so often. It had started, as these things do, quite reasonably. A few years earlier, Mark had attended a get together of young environmentalists like himself in a seaside town in England. There, he learned about something called genetic engineering. That's right, guys, it's the fucking GMOs. A giant chemical company named Monsanto had begun altering the DNA of seeds in order to grow better crops. It sounded fairly creepy to Mark. Why would they do such a thing? This was, yep, 1999. Okay. Oh boy. Why would they do such a thing? For profit, of course. Their new bioengineered plants had a superpower. They could survive the application of Monsanto's own noxious weed killer, known as Roundup. Mark leaned forward. Was he hearing this right? Monsanto was the same company, he learned, that had helped manufacture Agent Orange, a mixture of toxic weed killers that the U.S. military had used during the Vietnam War. Now the company was apparently creating an entire ecosystem in which only its own sci fi seeds could survive the storm of poison to come. Hearing this, Mark recognized a pattern. This was around the same time as the controversy over mad cow disease was roiling England. Thousands of cows had gotten sick with a fatal brain infection. For years, British officials had insisted there was no evidence humans could be harmed by contaminated beef. Are you sure about that? Yes, okay. There was no evidence humans could be harmed by contaminated beef. Everything was fine, carry on. But then it turned out they'd been totally wrong. A human variant of the disease did seem to be linked to the beef products. I need like a shocked Pikachu emote I can hit. I feel like shocked Pikachu really is going to be appropriate a lot during this. Da 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 da. Did seem to be linked to the beef products. The government was forced to recant. Eventually, more than 200 people would die. It was proof that the government could not be trusted, not when it came to protecting the public against huge corporations. And now it seemed it was happening all over again. A giant multinational company was meddling in the food supply, playing God with nature. The more Mark learned, the more outraged he got. He had to do something. So he wrote a screed, one of the first ever articles warning of the danger of genetically modified crops. Quote, in the great global genetic experiment, which is being pursued by chemical and food multinationals in their search for greater profit, we, the consumers, are the guinea pigs, he wrote in Corporate Watch magazine. He was warned that if companies, nope, sorry, he warned that if companies, quote, win their battle to force us to accept genetically engineered produce, the course of life on planet Earth may be changed forever, unquote. The threat was the threat was existential and urgent. Something else probably worth noting is that I read a lot for many, many years, but did not necessarily hear long words spoken out loud. So sometimes I might say things wrong. That's just part of living in my brain. Okay. The threat was existential and urgent. Quote, these are dangerous times ahead, unquote. The piece was compelling and it got people talking. So he wrote another and another. Then he started participating in, quote, decontaminations, like the one on the field that night. Later, Mark would wonder when he'd started missing things. It wasn't right away, he knew. He'd had good reason to be suspicious of Monsanto. I will say, I am also still pretty suspicious of Monsanto. But somewhere along the way, he'd started making mistakes. It was astonishing, really, looking back on it, but that was later. The police appeared suddenly across the open field that night. Mark dropped to the ground, heart hammering in his chest. This had not happened to him before. The beams of their flashlights arced across the field. He could hear the pop and static of their radios, and, as they got closer, the panting and whimpering of their dogs. Lying there, he remembered something he'd heard about police dogs, that they are trained to bite and not let go. He hoped it was not true. It occurred to him then how strange it all was. I'm quite law-abiding, I wear glasses. I don't want to get hit in the face with a truncheon. I'm not really into confrontational situations at all. And yet here he was, spectacles pressed into the freshly turned soil, hunted by dogs. The first time I read this, kind of struggled with the like timeline being out of order format of this whole introduction. So if you, like me, are a little bit struggling, basically, first, this guy learned about Monsanto doing like genetically modified plants uh, at about the same time as the mad cow scare in England, where he lived, and then went down a path to eco-terrorism, basically, and is trying to figure out what happened. Where did we go wrong? All right. High conflict. This is a book about the mysterious force that incites people to lose their minds in ideological disputes, political feuds, or gang vendettas. The force that causes us to lie awake at night, obsessed by a conflict with a coworker or a sibling or a politician we've never met. High conflict is different from the useful friction of healthy conflict. That's what I like to call good conflict, in homage to what the civil rights leader John Lewis called good trouble. Good conflict is a force that pushes us to be better people. Good conflict is not the same as forgiveness. It has nothing to do with surrender. It can be stressful and heated, but our dignity remains intact. Good conflict can lead to radical change, tectonic shifts in how societies operate, but it does not collapse into caricature. Nope, we remain open to the reality that none of us has all the answers to everything all the time and that we are all connected. We need healthy conflict in order to defend ourselves, to understand each other, and to improve. These days, we need much more of it, not less. High conflict, by contrast, is what happens when conflict clarifies into a good versus evil kind of feud, the kind with an us and a them. I feel like I don't need to give examples of this. I feel like we've all experienced it, perhaps even right now in this very country. In high conflict, the normal rules of engagement no longer apply. In this state, each encounter with the other side, whether literal or virtual, becomes more charged. The brain behaves differently. We feel increasingly certain of our own superiority, and at the same time, more and more mystified by the other side. When we encounter them, in person or on a cable news channel, we might feel a tightening in our chest, a dread mixed with rage as we listen to whatever insane, misguided, dangerous thing the other side says. The conflict feels like an existential threat, even if it isn't. So, I'm actually going to use a different example than current US politics because current US politics does feel like an existential threat, frankly, currently. And I don't know that I can externalize from that. So instead, what this actually makes me think of is when I was in Scientology, when I was working for the church, and I was like a fairly dedicated Scientologist, had drunk some of the Kool-Aid, um, at least enough of it to like be able to function in the cult. And I ran into this a lot with basically anybody who wasn't a Scientologist who then was talking about Scientology. If it came up in a podcast, a comedy set, an online article about something totally different, because Scientology is like kind of the butt of the joke a lot of the time. And especially in the 2010s, especially right after Leah Remini started airing her HBO series, a lot of people were talking about Scientology. And so you kind of were hearing it all the time as like throwaway jokes. And for someone who was not ever in the church and doesn't really pay attention to this stuff, probably didn't really clock it. But I tell you, every single time I heard the word Scientology or Scientologist or L. Ron Hubbard or any of the like keywords that Tom Cruise also, that people would make fun of, if I ever at that time heard it in the wild, my chest would tighten up, my stomach would drop, I would go into like fight or flight because I would feel like I suddenly was having to like go to battle to defend my faith. Um, Crazy, crazy, absolutely unnecessary. Did not need to like have a fight or flight response every single time. But like that is very black and white, us versus them thinking. Okay, back to the book. The conflict feels like an existential threat, even if it isn't. Both sides often feel this same emotion, interestingly, although they don't discuss it with each other. Whatever we do to try to end the conflict, calling someone out on social media or complaining to HR about an obnoxious coworker, only makes things worse. That's because, as we'll see, any intuitive thing you do in high conflict usually backfires. You have to do counterintuitive things and do them with great care. Some people are more susceptible to high conflict than others. They are what therapists call high conflict personalities. These people are quick to blame, certain they are right, and always on guard. Most of us know someone like this. Someone for whom the fault lines are clear and always lead away from themselves. Most of us are not like this. Most of us try to avoid high conflict whenever possible. This avoidance brings its own problems, as we'll see. Eventually, high conflict affects all of us one way or another. Either we get drawn into high conflict ourselves, or we watch people or communities we care about get trapped by it, sometimes for generations, which unfortunately, I'm sure we can all think of examples of that. Fandoms especially get ripped apart by high conflict personalities like crazy. Again and again, in research spanning different continents, people in high conflict explain their frustrations as a justifiable response to the other side's initial aggression. Regardless of the facts, both sides are convinced that they're reacting defensively somehow. They find themselves returning to the feud over and over, itemizing the indignities, tending to it like a fire. How does this happen? In theory, most people appreciate the danger of demonizing their siblings or neighbors. Very few of us actually want to live in perpetual tension with other people. So, why do we continue to do it? Why can't we get back to good conflict even when we want to? That is the first mystery of this book, which begins in a paradise on the coast of Northern California. Here we meet Gary Friedman, a world renowned conflict expert who decides to enter local politics in the hopes of changing it for the better. We start small, focusing on a conflict that escalated quietly in an unexpected place to understand the layers of this phenomenon. Us versus them conflict is rarely about what it seems to be about. It has an understory, which is the most interesting part. The corn plants are never just corn plants. Side note, are they called corn plants? I guess, like, they would be. I've never heard them called that. Anyway, the important thing here is not the corn plants. It is the us versus them conflict is rarely about what it seems to be about. Like, so true. It's so true. Because it's never just like, yes, we definitely hate each other for all of the specific reasons that we're saying, and we're not holding anything back. There's always like secret reasons that the conflict is continuing, you know? All right, so we start small, focusing on this conflict with Gary Friedman entering politics, poor man. Then we'll investigate how conflicts explode. Why do some conflicts ignite, becoming violent and lasting for generations, while others just simmer or fade away altogether? We'll meet Curtis Toller, a former gang leader who spent years transfixed by a vendetta in Chicago, to learn about the four accelerants that inflame conflict all over the world. The goal is to understand high conflict better so we can see it coming and help ourselves or other people shift out of it if we want to, which leads to the most interesting mystery of all. People do escape high conflict. Individuals, even entire communities, find ways to short circuit the feedback loops of conflict. They don't suddenly agree, and this is important, they don't surrender their beliefs. Nor do they defect, switching from one position to the opposite extreme. Instead, they do something much more interesting. They become capable of comprehending that which with they still disagree. Like someone who learns a second language, they start to hear the other side without compromising their own beliefs. And that changes everything. Curiosity returns, humanity revives, IQs go back up. Conflict becomes necessary and good instead of just draining. I will tell you, it does feel like a switch being flipped internally. I, the first time I read this book, at the end of the book, was like, first of all, I think that changed my brain chemistry. Second of all, I have been so deeply involved in so much high conflict for so much of my life, um, especially with Scientology. You know, like I said before, being in the church was very, very high conflict, and Scientology, like many cults, like most doomsday cults, um, it lends itself to high conflict because as long as they can keep you thinking us versus them, we are the good guys, everyone outside the cult is the bad guys. We have to, defend ourselves slash rescue them, whatever. Um, it keeps you stuck. It keeps you very stuck in it. And realizing that was very, very freeing. Um, but also was not a cure all. I am definitely not perfect at this. All right. So, how does this happen? This shift from high conflict to healthy conflict. What are the patterns? What needs to happen first, second, and third? And can the process be nudged along? The short answer is yes. I've now seen this shift happen and felt it occur in myself again and again. But it won't happen on its own. It requires us to take a series of steps, none of which feel natural at first. Can entire towns or even countries follow these unintuitive steps to prevent or disrupt high conflict at scale? To find out, we'll go to Bogota, Colombia to meet Sandra Milena Vera Bustos, a guerrilla fighter who chose to take a formal, legal, and optional path out of civil war, and who understands what needs to happen to help many thousands of other people make that journey. Finally, we'll see what it looks like to inoculate a place against high conflict from the beginning. We'll return to the United States to an unusual synagogue just outside of Central Park in New York City. This congregation learns to handle conflict differently, investigating it with curiosity and conviction, even when it's deeply uncomfortable. We will follow along as a group of liberal Jews travel from this synagogue to rural Michigan and spend 3 days in the homes of conservative Trump supporters who work in their local prisons. It is a bewildering and provocative scene. Two groups going against most of their instincts to try to make political conflict healthy again instead of high. And I will tell you now, we are not going to get to that scene in this stream because it's near the end of the book. It did make me cry. This phenomenon of high conflict is fascinating and misunderstood. If we don't learn to recognize, navigate, and even prevent it, we will all be in its thrall sooner or later. As we'll see, we can get so mesmerized by high conflict that we don't realize we have somehow started fighting on the wrong side against our own cause. We can end up sacrificing what we most treasure. So true, bestie. The invisible hand. I grew up around a fair amount of conflict. It wasn't extreme. I got plenty of food, love, and second chances. But my mom struggled with bouts of depression and anxiety, and she reverted to anger and blame when she felt threatened, which was often. So I spent a lot of time sitting on the stairs of our New Jersey home, drawing shapes with my index finger into the moss green 1980s carpet, listening to my parents fight. I'd listened for content, but mostly for tone. My father was plenty culpable too, of course, but all I could hear from upstairs was my mother's voice. As it got higher and louder, my stomach would fill with dread. My brother closed his bedroom door and played with his Star Wars action figures when this happened, a wise move. But back then I wanted to listen. For some reason, it felt important to monitor what was happening, to surveil the conflict. Maybe I thought it would help me predict what was going to happen next, or even prevent it. As I got older, I found a way to witness conflict for a living. As a journalist for Time magazine, I covered crime, disasters, terrorism, all manner of human misery. Then I covered education, which, despite all the pretty talk of children and learning, is its own high conflict in America. Uh, out of all the hate mail I've received, the only person who's ever called me the C word was a teacher responding to a story I'd written on education reform, which tracks. That tracks. Hey, that makes sense to me. Oh boy. There was a strange kind of comfort in this role. Subconsciously, I was still that kid, believing that I could somehow protect myself and everyone else by chronicling conflict, never letting it out of my sight. After the 2016 US presidential election, I had to admit my master plan had failed. I couldn't predict conflict. I couldn't even understand it, not even in my own country. How could so many people be perceiving the world so differently with such utter conviction? Half of Democrats and Republicans saw members of the opposing party as not just ill informed, but actually frightening. Even as Americans continued to agree on many policy matters, we began to dehumanize one another based on our political affinities. By some estimates, 38 million Americans stopped talking to a family member or friend because of that election. Now, I do have some opinions about this section. Um, and Also, I was in the Sea Org in 2016. I didn't get out until October 2018. And even then, I was pretty much in survival mode and like figuring out how to be a person until like 2020 when both COVID and the George Floyd protests happened. Not exactly simultaneously, but pretty damn close. And all of a sudden, I had to reconcile with the fact that I was not just free from Scientology and living like my free life where I could do whatever I want, but like, oh no, like I'm actually part of society. I need to understand how this shit works. I need to like understand what politics even is. And so like it took me a little bit to catch up. So I can't really it's hard for me to speak to how I experienced 2016 and the 2016 election because my experience of it was very, very sequestered. It's not quite the right word. I was very cut off from the outside world, and vast majority of Scientologists are Republicans. So it didn't seem like a huge deal at the time, but obviously it was. And like where we're at now is probably a lot worse than we were in 2016 in terms of people like cutting each other off and dehumanizing each other and so on and so forth. I really struggle though because it's very clear from the number of like Trump supporters and people on the right and whatever who do violent acts that there is some danger there. And like I've not quite figured out how to come to terms with that in the interest of like resolving and getting out of high conflict, if that makes sense. I don't know that anybody here is going to have an answer to it either, but it is something that I like think about quite frequently. Anyway, back to the book. It felt like curiosity was dead. What was the point of telling stories in such a time? Of painstakingly reporting and fact checking every detail, only to be speaking to the same shrinking choir of partisans? 2 out of 3 Americans said they didn't really trust the news media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. Many actively avoided the news because it was so depressing. Others were addicted to it because it was so enraging. For a while, I blamed America's unique pathologies. Maybe our history of racism, combined with extreme economic inequality, had created a perfect storm of political polarization. That was part of the answer. But looking around, it was plain to see that these problems weren't limited to America. In other countries, people were storming out of family dinners because of differences over refugees or Brexit or fuel prices. In Argentina, Nine out of 10 people said their country was very or fairly divided. In Norway and Denmark, there was a major schism over how to handle wild wolves, which she actually talks about like way at the very end of this book. Um, this is chilling due to the recent exodus of journalists. Yeah, oh, for sure. And this book was published. Let me actually see when this book was published. 2021. Book was published in 2021. All right. In Oregon, no, how to handle wild wolves. Yes. In New Zealand, it was cats. Yes, cats. And I don't have the full story on that one, but I would bet you anything it's either arguments over declawing cats or more. I'm putting all my eggs in this basket, actually. I think it's indoor cat versus outdoor cat discourse because they're an island nation. Okay. In New Zealand, it was cats. Yes, cats. Half of Europeans said their society was less tolerant than it was a decade ago. We are experiencing permanent indignation, a kind of social rage, Frank Walter Steinmeier, the president of Germany, said. Germany does not talk. Germany shouts and screams. Surely the explanation had something to do with YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, which fueled endless conflict loops by design, and media sensationalism, which converted outrage into profit. Attention economies rewarded our worst instincts at massive scale. On TV and online, we were greeted on TV and online, we were greeted by a chorus of trolls, goading us on, hissing that we were right. All of this mattered, but none of these explanations felt quite adequate. There were lots of people who weren't spending much time on social media, but were still at each other's throats. Something else was happening too, something that had not been named. So I tried to find what I'd missed. I spent time with people who have worked on raging conflicts of other kinds in other places, from Rwanda to Colombia to Israel. I completed 80 hours of conflict mediation training focused on interpersonal conflicts like divorce and workplace and custody battles. I started to see how similarly people behave in very different conflicts. 5 years later, here's what I've learned. Lots of forces got us to this place. Technological change, demographic shifts, globalization, badly regulated markets, and rapid social change have caused waves of anxiety and suspicion. Humans are not wired to manage change at this pace. It feels disorienting at best, threatening at worst. So we hunt for a story to explain our unease, a way to claw back some control over the chaos. That desperate search for a storyline and a scapegoat makes it easy for opportunistic leaders, pundits, and platforms to exploit our most reliable social fissures, including prejudices of all kinds. But there is another invisible force that, like gravity, exerts its pull on everything else. When conflict escalates past a certain point, the conflict itself takes charge. The original facts and forces that led to the dispute fade into the background. The us versus them dynamic takes over. Actual differences of opinion on healthcare policy or immigration stop mattering, and the conflict becomes its own reality. High conflict is the invisible hand of our time. I don't even have anything to say extra to say about that. It's just like mwah, mwah, mwah. Correct. Closed. In the 1930s, the city of Montgomery, Alabama, built a public recreational facility called Oak Park. It featured a large swimming pool with a modern filtration system and a smaller wading pool for little children. There were 6 clay tennis courts and a merry-go-round. They even built a zoo, complete with a bear, alligators, and monkeys. It was a municipal wonderland. But there was an us and a them in Montgomery and all over the United States, a high conflict that dated back hundreds of years. Oak Park was for white people only. This was in 1930, in the 1930s, excuse me. One fall day in 1957, a young black man named Mark Gilmore took a shortcut home from work through Oak Park. He got arrested for violating the segregation policy. When he challenged the policy in court, a federal judge ruled that the city's whites only policy was unconstitutional. All the citizens had paid for the park to be built, including black taxpayers, and so it had to be open to all. It was a huge victory for equality and justice, or so it seemed. But what happened next? Instead of integrating, the city shuttered all of its parks. If white people couldn't swim without blacks, then no one could swim at all. The Oak Park pools were drained and filled with dirt, the bear, alligators, and monkeys given away or sold. The pools have never been reopened. Everyone lost, black and white. And I feel like and when I say we, I mean lefties, politically left internet denizens. Um, when we talk about policy changes that hurt everyone, this is exactly that. This is very specifically that. It's everybody doesn't get access to healthcare because we don't want trans people to have healthcare. It's nobody gets a job because we don't want black people to have jobs. It's our all of our lives are immeasurably worse because the people in power don't want certain marginalized groups of people to have privileges. And that's fucked. It's my professional opinion that it's fucked. All right, back to the book. This is a sure sign of high conflict. Every attempt to make things better seems to make it worse. The losses accumulate. Good conflict is vital. Life would be much worse without it. It's a lot like fire. We need some heat to survive, to illuminate what we've gotten wrong and protect ourselves from predators. We need turbulent city council meetings, strained date night dinners, protests and strikes, clashes in boardrooms, and guidance counselor offices. People who try to live without any conflict, who never argue or mourn, tend to implode sooner or later, as any psychologist will tell you, or any high masking autistic person. Living without conflict is like living without love, cold and eventually unbearable. But if conflict shifts into high conflict, it can burn down the whole damn house. The distinction matters. I'd spent my life monitoring conflict, but like most journalists, I was missing the understory, the most interesting part. It was a revelation. I started to see that political polarization is not its own special category of problem. People behave very similarly in all kinds of high conflict, from neighborhood feuds to divorce courts to labor strikes. High conflicts are magnetic. Until we understand this, our differences will feel bigger and more inevitable than they are. Wicked feuds have a way of luring us in, driving us to act in ways that go against our own best interests. We've all felt this at some level. Once we're drawn into a conflict like this, our field of vision narrows. Matters become very clear. Too clear. We think we are acting on our own volition, making judgments based on hard facts and deeply held values. But are we? And that, dear reader, is what's known as foreshadowing. Um, Yeah, like highly agree. Conflict is super necessary because you would never be able to get anything done if you had to just everyone had to just agree with each other all the time. Like totally not even taking into account the emotional toll and everything else, but like if everyone had to agree with everyone else, we would all just be in a circle like patting each other's backs and nothing would get done. Also, hydration break. If you have not hydrated recently, do so on pain of death. All right. Doubt. That dark night in England, the police dogs did not find Mark lying in the field. So this is for those of you just joining us. We started out the intro with a um, ecological activist protesting against GMOs, sneaking into somebody's cornfield and like cutting down a bunch of stalks of corn, and then the cops showed up, and he was like, "Oh fuck, this is not what I signed up for." That dark night in England, the police dogs did not find Mark lying in the field. He made a run for it just in time, sprinting over a barbed wire fence to a nearby field where he hid in the undergrowth until dawn. So he carried on, campaigning against genetically modified crops in all kinds of creative ways. In 2001, in 2001, Mark walked into a Borders bookstore in Oxford and threw a supermarket sponge cake into the face of a Danish statistics professor with whom he disagreed. Not like the right way to handle conflict, but arguably the funniest way to handle conflict. I am not saying what he did was right, but I am saying I would love to see footage. The professor, who received the sponge cake, was promoting his book, in which he detailed why he'd abandoned some of his more extreme views on the environment. That's for everything you say about the environment, which is complete bullshit, Mark yelled in an unnaturally high voice. It was all very awkward, not at all like he'd imagined. The statistics professor very quietly wiped the whipped cream from his face. The audience, waiting for the reading to begin, stared at Mark, confused. He paced back and forth by the book signing table, wondering why no security guard had arrived to haul him away. He had not planned to give a speech, so he improvised. I feel like that was the wrong move. Uh, Followed by several prior moves that were also the wrong move. That's for lying about climate change, he said. That's what you deserve for being smug about everything to do with the environment. I mean, I'm not saying that he was right. I am saying that maybe if very, very smug people got caked in the face occasionally, that wouldn't be so bad. I fear that I might be on the receiving end of some cakes, though, so maybe not. All right, back to Mark. What are you doing, Mark? He was finally escorted out a few moments later, which came as a relief. He felt embarrassed. Confrontation just wasn't his kind of thing. But he still believed he was fighting the good fight. And it was working. As the years went by, his side registered a series of stunning victories. Governments in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia banned most genetically modified crops, persuaded by the arguments of environmentalists like him. It was one of the most impactful leftist opposition campaigns in his lifetime. And yet, every now and then, Mark would experience a tremor of doubt. One day, rioting broke out at protests he'd helped organize in London. Windows were smashed, 9 police officers were injured. Afterward, as his fellow activists celebrated at a pub, he felt sick to his stomach. These moments crept up on him suddenly like vertigo. He was in this fight in order to protect the environment and help the most vulnerable among us. He was standing up to big corporations, rightly demanding that they be held accountable. And yet something else was happening too. And like, I will also say, very small side note here, the spikes of doubt, like all at a time when you should be celebrating, or like when you're not thinking about it, all of a sudden being like, what are we doing here? That is what it was like being in a cult. Straight up. 100%. Uh I experienced that. And I experienced it more and more and more as I like got ready to and then left. But there were always spikes of doubt that I just like was never able to resolve. Like, who can you even ask? Who can you go to and be like, hey, I'm having doubts about like this belief system that everyone here thinks is the answer to like life, the universe, and everything. You kind of just have to deal with that on your own. Ooh. All right. And yet something else was happening too. In 2002, a severe drought and famine spread across Africa. Millions of people went hungry, but the government of Zambia turned away all imports of genetically modified corn, citing the alleged dangers of the food. Zambians had been eating this same kind of corn for years, so had Americans, but now when it was needed most, the corn was deemed impure. Enthralled to high conflict, Mark and his fellow activists had helped turn much of the world against genetically modified crops based on very little scientific evidence, and now people were dying. Simply because my people are hungry, that's no justification to give them poison, to give them food that is intrinsically dangerous to their health. Zambian President Levi, I'm going to try to say this name, Levi Mwanawasa said. I think that's how it is. Zambian President Levi Mwanawasa said, the United Nations World Food Program began removing the food aid it had delivered. It was a tragedy layered on top of a catastrophe. Zambian leaders' distrust of foreign aid had long and complicated roots, but the crusading of activists like Mark was making a terrible situation worse. For years, Mark managed to avoid reckoning with his doubts. Humans are very good at this. When new scientific studies came out showing that genetically modified food could be safe and even life saving, there was always a reason to dismiss them. It wasn't hard until it was. The world as it is. Let's just acknowledge that high conflict can be useful. It feels good. It gives life meaning. But these days, high conflict has reached the upper limit of its usefulness. Again and again, the problems we face as a civilization seem to be made worse, not better, by high conflict. The challenge of our time is to mobilize great masses of people to make change without dehumanizing one another. Not just because it's morally right, but because it works. Lasting change, the kind that seeps into people's hearts, has only ever come about through a combination of pressure and good conflict. Both matter. That's why, over the course of history, nonviolent movements have been more than twice as likely to succeed as violent ones. That is interesting, and I wonder if she has a citation for it. Let's see. So sorry. I know this is not uh super duper interesting to watch me look for citations. Um, but aha. Okay, nonviolent movements. These movements, which include boycotts, strikes, and protests, succeed because they attract big and diverse followings, enough people to put sustained, meaningful pressure on the levers of power. Chenoweth and Stefan, Why Civil Resistance Works. Okay, putting a pin in that because I feel like talking about violent protest versus nonviolent protest is kind of useless without defining violence. Like, what does someone consider violent versus nonviolent? Does property damage count? Does physical damage count? Does it count if someone accidentally got hurt? Like, anyway, that's not what this book is about. I just wanted to make a note of that. Um, But I do agree. Yeah, and what caused the violence? Exactly. Like, were the protesters violent, or did the cops show up and start fucking beating them over the head, and then it became violent in response? Like, I too much missing information here. I do agree, though, that the big challenge of our time is to mobilize great masses of people to make change without dehumanizing one another, because I feel like we've mobilized a lot of people by dehumanizing each other, and that does not seem to be working very well. Just my opinion. All right. High conflict is extremely flammable. It can easily tip into violence, which leads the opposition to respond with more violence in an ever escalating spiral of harm. Very quickly, the most helpful people flee the scene and the extremists take over. It's another reason that I am determined to stick it out here instead of trying to flee the country. Like, with what money, first of all? But second of all, like, if everybody flees, then what happens to the people who can't? Any modern movement that cultivates us versus them thinking tends to destroy itself from the inside, with or without violence. High conflict is intolerant of difference. A culture that sorts the world into good and evil is, by definition, small and confining. It prevents people from working together in large numbers to grapple with hard problems. And we see this a lot on the left, like in leftist groups. I'm speaking in very broad generalities here, but anybody who has spent any time on the left, in leftist groups, especially online leftist groups, it is like a joke at this point that leftists make because it is everyone, not everyone, but many people who are involved in politics and feel very strongly about it. If you are not a conservative, you will probably end up in some segment of the left. And even with the best of intentions and stated goals and beliefs, like you get enough people feeling very rigidly about good versus evil, right versus wrong, and you do end up with a group that destroys itself from the inside, even when, like, theoretically it shouldn't. Uh, you see this in fandoms, you see this in nonprofits, like, you see this all over the place. And, like, it's the us versus them thinking. It's a poison. The coronavirus pandemic drove this lesson home like a jackhammer. On December 31st, 2019, Chinese health officials reported a cluster of pneumonia cases in Wuhan City, Hubei province. I hope I didn't butcher that, to the World Health Organization. 2 weeks later, a Washington state resident returned to America from Wuhan, arriving at the airport with no symptoms at all. 4 days after that, he sought medical attention for what turned out to be COVID-19. Meanwhile, Chinese authorities downplayed the severity of the threat to the public, and the World Health Organization repeatedly assured the world that the situation was under control. In New York, the first official COVID-19 positive test was announced on March 1st, 2020. But the virus had been spreading silently through the city for weeks, if not months, largely through travelers from Europe, not China. Before that first positive test, an estimated 11,000 New Yorkers may have already contracted the virus. Like, side note, I swear to God I got it in February of 2020. I was so sick. I have never been that sick in my fucking life. And there were no COVID tests, like no way to test to see what it was. That fucking sucked. All right. By the end of April, the global economy had shuddered to a halt, and over 26 million Americans had filed for unemployment benefits, myself included. You also in February? Yeah, I'm sure that that's what it was. It was like because I went in, I was like, oh, it's a sinus infection. I was like, this I've had sinus infections. This feels different, but okay. And then got put on antibiotics that I had an allergic reaction to, and ended up in the ER from the allergic reaction to the antibiotics, which wouldn't have worked on COVID anyway. Anyway, I'm salty. Our healthcare system sucks, and I'm salty. All right. By the end of April, 26 million Americans, unemployment benefits were caught up. You lost your taste, smell, and they could not figure out why you were so sick. They called it the flu. Yeah, like I mean, I get it. What else were they gonna call it? Like nobody knew. But ugh, ugh. All right, end of April. At that point, more than 3 million people were confirmed to have been infected with the virus worldwide. Overnight, the human species was threatened by a common enemy, a new, wickedly contagious virus. It was an unprecedented opportunity to link arms with one another, regardless of party affiliation, race, or citizenship. God, if only. Moment of silence for the world that could have been. And at first, most people did exactly that all over the world, even in hyper-polarized nations. In late March, 90% of Americans said that they believed we're all in it together, from 63% in the fall of 2018. The US Senate passed a massive federal stimulus bill by a vote of 96-0, a consensus that would have been unimaginable just a month earlier. And then celebrities put out that fucking video where they all sang along to Imagine, and we all went, nope, we're not in this together. Goodbye. That's not from the book. That's my own opinion, and not a particularly serious one. People are wired to sort the world into us and them. but we're also wired to expand our definition of us under certain conditions. Big shocks like a pandemic can make us encompass the entire world overnight. But high conflict is magnetic. It is very hard to resist, especially for people who have, in the past, found great meaning, camaraderie, and power in perpetuating high conflict. In India, a majority Hindu country, news outlets began blaming Muslims for spreading the coronavirus after an early outbreak was traced back to an Islamic missionary gathering. Corona Jihad started trending on Twitter. I didn't even know about that. That fucking sucks. In the United States, President Donald Trump blamed China, In the United States, President Donald Trump blamed China, correctly criticizing Chinese authorities for suppressing information about the virus in the beginning of the outbreak. Then he blamed the World Health Organization, declaring that the US would withdraw funding and cut ties to the organization because of its slowness to react to the pandemic. Here again, he had a point. The World Health Organization had made mistakes and should be held accountable. But a pandemic is a global emergency. Managing it requires collaboration. Blame is self defeating. Cutting funding to the world's only central fire department in the middle of a rip roaring 9 alarm fire made a terrible situation a little worse. Suddenly, essential workers at the World Health Organization and the White House were managing politics instead of public health. Meanwhile, thousands of American schools reopened or stayed shuttered based on politics, not science. Children and families suffered unnecessarily. People died who did not have to die, which side note here, I don't think she goes into it in this book. It's a totally different subject, but absolutely worth saying. Um, and this might not be something that y'all know if you are not uh if you don't have your finger on the pulse of what like the disability community is talking about. Oh, hello, thank you for the follow. um the coronavirus pandemic is referred to by a lot of disability activists as uh oh god, genocide. It's referred to as a genocide because the number of people who were killed by COVID and specifically disabled people, um, including a lot of very prominent activists who we could really use right now, died to COVID unnecessarily. And it's a goddamn shame. So also, that's why I still mask in public, by the way. Little plug here for masking when you're in public spaces because you don't know who is immunocompromised just by looking at them. And masking up could save the lives of some of the people around you and maybe even your own. All right, back to the book. People died who did not have to die. The habits of high conflict are hard to break, but they self destruct in the modern world where there are few bright lines dividing us and them. Today, an outbreak can travel from a remote village to any major city in the world in less than a day and a half. Between 1980 and 2013, there were 12,012 recorded outbreaks of infectious diseases affecting 44 million people and nearly every country in the world. That was all before the coronavirus pandemic. Over half of the world's population now lives in dense urban cities, making it easy for viruses to spread. And the globalized economy has captured us like a spider web, intertwining our financial futures, even if we manage to protect our physical health. Rivalries and hatreds between groups are nothing new, the psychologist Gordon Allport wrote in the 1954 preface to his classic book, The Nature of Prejudice. What is new is the fact that technology has brought these groups too close together for comfort. We have not yet learned how to adjust to our new mental and moral proximity. Oh my god, hello, Kinosaur. Welcome to the stream. Thank you for the raid. Um, we are about an hour in. I'm reading from High Conflict and yapping about it as I go. Absolutely feel free to chime in the chat if you so desire, or you can just hang out and listen while I yap. And I'm recording and I'll be posting the full the full recording when it's done. So if you want to go back and listen to the stuff you missed, you absolutely can. All right. We have not yet learned how to adjust to our new mental and moral proximity. We are all connected. We have to adapt. This is the central challenge of our time to create institutions and societies designed for good conflict, not high conflict, built to respond to problems without collapsing into dehumanization. We know this is possible because people have done it in big and small ways all over the planet, as we'll see. On May 25th, 2020, a 46-year-old black man named George Floyd was killed by a white Minneapolis police officer who knelt on Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes, even as Floyd said repeatedly that he could not breathe. The killing, much of which was captured on video, sparked protests across Minneapolis and around the world. The scale of the response created a historic opening for serious conversations about race and justice and major policy changes. In many places, the conflict was intense but healthy, but not everywhere. In some places, people committed acts of violence against the police and against one another. Police officers and federal agents used tear gas and weapons on peaceful demonstrators in some cities. Certain politicians demonized protesters, and some activists vilified the police, generalizing wildly and unfairly. At least a dozen additional Americans died in the unrest, most from gunshot wounds. The violence led people to come up with justifications for more violence in response, which is what usually happens in high conflict. Then came the 2020 election and the storming of the Capitol by a mob of Trump supporters on January 6, 2021. Here again, there was a golden opportunity to shift into good conflict in the pause created by this shock. But the country, battered by division and disease, manipulated by conflict entrepreneurs, remained its own worst enemy. Even when evidence accumulated that masks and ventilation reduced the threat, that schools could safely reopen, that vaccines were very safe for most people, the high conflict raged on. Many thousands of people were going to die from the pandemic no matter what, but at least 163,000 Americans died who did not have to die, casualties not just of the virus, but of high conflict itself. And this book came out in 2021. So that death count is unfortunately much higher now. An escape. One summer day in 2008, The Guardian, a newspaper in the UK, asked Mark Linus to write a quick piece attacking genetically modified crops, as he'd done many times before. In under an hour, he knocked off a story warning that genetically modified superweeds, bacteria, or viruses could, quote, run rampant and breed, unquote, contaminating other fields. It was an argument he'd made before. But after the piece appeared, something strange happened. He glanced at the comments underneath, and he felt unsettled. One person complained that Mark lacked, quote, any kind of scientific knowledge and understanding, unquote. The criticism stung in a way it hadn't in the past. So Mark decided to defend himself. He began searching around for empirical evidence backing up his argument. He clicked through page after page, scanning journal articles and books. He scrolled and scrolled, his heart rate rising. He could not find anything credible. The scientific evidence to date did not support his fears and long-standing claims. To the contrary, what he saw was a pretty clear consensus in the opposite direction. Genetically modified crops could, in some cases, benefit the environment and alleviate suffering. They didn't require as much pesticide because they were bred to be resistant to pests. In countries that used genetically modified crops, pesticide use had declined by about 30%. 30%. That's a huge decrease. Nothing was simple. Monsanto and other companies had made mistakes. They could have done a much better job introducing their genetically modified crops. And asterisk could have also not been giant, evil, greedy companies that go after farmers for some of the Monsanto plants growing in the farmer's field because that's how ecosystems work and like wind and seeds and anyway, off topic. Back to the book. They could have done a much better job introducing their genetically modified crops. But rather than wrecking the planet, these crops could help save it. With the best of intentions, Mark had worked to block immense progress from happening across Africa and Europe for years. He sat back in his seat, feeling suddenly warm. The realization was physical, not just intellectual, like leaning over an abyss. A crack had opened up in my worldview, and I didn't know what I would find on the other side. Many people had accused Mark of ignoring the science before. He'd debated scientists and rejected their arguments for years. There were no new facts in this scenario. So why did this time feel different? A series of experiences had shifted Mark's loyalties and opened his mind, as we'll see. He could not easily close it again. 5 years later, Mark stood up before thousands of farmers at a conference in England and gave a speech no one there would ever forget. Now, my lords, ladies, and gentlemen, I want to start with some apologies, he said. For the record, here and up front, I want to apologize for having spent several years ripping up genetically modified crops. He'd written down every word of the speech in advance, knowing he'd be nervous. He looked up through his glasses every 10 seconds or so to make eye contact with the audience. I am also sorry, he went on, that I assisted in demonizing an important technological option which can and should be used to benefit the environment. This was not a defection. Mark remained obsessed with fighting climate change and exploitative corporations. It wasn't that I'd stopped believing in climate change, he told me. It was that I started realizing that what we were doing wasn't working. He wrote 3 books on climate change after giving this speech. But from that day onward, he told a more sophisticated and precise story. He continued to publicly criticize businesses and politicians, but he did it with less contempt. As he shifted out of high conflict, he became more effective, not less. He was no longer wasting so much time fighting battles against people who wanted many of the same things he did. There are other people like Mark, some of whom we'll meet in this book, some of whom are reading a book out loud on stream right now. Ooh. People who understand the lure of high conflict, the enormous toll it takes, and who appreciate what it takes to break free. To thrive in the modern world, we need to understand how this happens. We need to step back from high conflict and marvel at its contours. Then we can recognize the way it warps our vision and imagine another way to live. Wishing your opponent will finally see the light is a fool's errand. It will only lead to heartbreak. Counting up the other side's wrongs is a hobby that can last a lifetime. Obsessing over the next election is a delay tactic. Telling people to reject hate and choose love will not work because people swept up in high conflict do not think of themselves as full of hate, even if they are. They think of themselves as right. Hate is an important emotion, but it's a symptom. High conflict is the cause, and high conflict is a system, not a feeling. So, that is the intro to high conflict. And there is a glossary of terms as well as a list of principal characters. So, also, like, if I am, again, if I'm reading and I say something that doesn't make sense, stop me. I will glossary it. Also, if I say a bunch of names and you're like, who the fuck are we talking about? Ask me. I will go to the cast of characters and look it up. Because I also forget names and words and all kinds of shit. Forget my own head if it wasn't attached to my neck. Okay. Chapter 1. The understory of conflict. And the principal characters in this chapter are Gary Friedman, who was mentioned a little bit earlier. He's a conflict mediator, author, and former trial lawyer. And he ran for local office in his town of Muir Beach, California. When they asked to meet with Gary Friedman, they didn't say why. But Jay and Lorna were old friends, so Gary invited them to come by his law office in a leafy neighborhood in Northern California. They showed up at the appointed time and told him their news. They wanted to get divorced, and they wanted Gary to help them. Both of them at once. Gary was stunned, not so much by their decision to get divorced. Gary knew they'd been struggling. Jay had been having an affair. They had 3 young children and not enough steady income. All that Gary knew already. No, what surprised him the most was that they wanted him to be their lawyer, their only lawyer. I could only represent one of you, he said gently, looking back and forth between them. Hearing this, Lorna's face fell. Gary tried to explain. To try to represent you both would result in a conflict of interest. They were dear friends, but for some reason, he found it hard to talk to them that way this moment. Although I support your desire to keep the divorce amicable, to fully protect your interests, you really are going to need separate lawyers. The more he talked, the less he liked himself. Even representing one of you would be hard to do, since I'm a friend to you both. Lorna interrupted him. We don't want you to take sides. We just want you to help us make decisions. Why can't you just help us and not be on either side? The truth is, it had never occurred to Gary that he could be on both sides, or neither side, that such a thing was even possible. It was the late 1970s, and the legal profession just didn't work that way. The law is much more complicated than you think, Gary said, and he knew he was right. But something else bothered him, even as he spoke. He'd been railing against the law for years now. His profession was excessively adversarial, as he'd told everyone who would listen, including these same friends. He'd wanted to find a new way to practice law, one that left his clients better off. So why was he now reciting the platitudes of the profession as if he believed them? Sitting there, Gary felt as dismayed as Jay and Lorna did. So he paused. He allowed himself to contemplate, for a moment, what they were asking. Maybe this was the chance he'd been looking for, to do something different. You know what? He said, you're right. You should be able to do this. I want to help. I don't know how to do it, but I'm happy to try. It was crazy on its face. He had no experience doing divorces, he told them, let alone in this radical new way. But even as he issued those caveats, he saw his friends' expressions change. They looked hopeful for the first time in a while. Sorry, I lost my place. There we go. They looked hopeful for the first time in a while, and he felt the same way. For 4 months, the three of them worked together in the same room. It was uncomfortable. Sometimes it was brutal when Jay and Lorna started yelling at each other about who got the house or custody of the children. Jay wanted more time with the kids, but Lorna didn't want Jay's girlfriend around them, and on and on. It felt at these moments like they were caught in a vortex. Jay and Lorna hated the fact that they were fighting, but they couldn't stop. Gary worried he was failing them. He felt like he was walking a high wire without a safety net. But it also felt liberating in a strange way. Normally, his clients were on the outside of the arena while he fought on their behalf, using the blunt weapons of the law. Now he was with them, accompanying them through their problems. This felt right because they understood their own problems better than anyone, which meant they should understand how to solve their problems better than anyone. In theory. One day, in a pause in the bickering, Gary made a suggestion. He asked them to close their eyes and imagine their lives 10 years in the future. He asked them to visualize the kind of relationship they wanted to have with their kids and with each other at that point. He reminded them of the time horizon. They would be in one another's lives forever. That was just the way it was. If their daughter got married, they'd both be there. If their son had a child, they'd need to deal with each other. He traveled through time with them, and for a moment, Jay and Lorna went quiet. They were reminded that they were stuck with each other even after the divorce. So then what? Jay and Lorna eventually came to an agreement about the house, the kids, and everything else. And for Gary, it was proof. Proof that there was another way to do conflict, one that honored the relationships between people. He knew he had a lot to learn, but it was possible. Just because people were getting a divorce didn't mean they had to hate each other. After they signed the papers, Jay and Lorna hugged Gary and each other. After that, Gary never practiced law the same way again. Hearing about Jay and Lorna's divorce, other couples came to see him, wanting to try this thing he called mediation. That's right, baby. Gary invented mediation. Holy shit. Establishment lawyers advised their clients not to go to Gary. People came anyway. Sometimes they came because their lawyers had told them not to. D- yeah, that tracks. He never had trouble getting clients. People are drawn to Gary because he seems to do the impossible, tap into our best selves at our worst moments. Because as much as humans like to fight, we also want very badly to find peace. High conflict makes us miserable. It is costly in every sense: money, blood, friendships. This is the first paradox of conflict. We are animated by conflict and also haunted by it. We want it to end and we want it to continue. That's where Gary comes in. I need like a shoulder Gary. I need like a pocket Gary to just hang out and be like, do you really want to send that comment, bestie? Look inside your own heart. Is this the DM you should be sending right now? I feel like that would be very helpful. When Gary started doing this work in the mid 1970s, the local bar association investigated him. It could not possibly be ethical for the same person to advise a husband and a wife together in the same room, or so the thinking went. But nothing came of it, and eventually the legal profession came around to Gary's approach. By the 1980s, the American Bar Association was hiring Gary to teach other lawyers his new way of navigating all kinds of conflicts. The conflict trap. In the Miracle Mile district of Los Angeles, there exists a prehistoric death trap gurgling away right off Wilshire Boulevard, a block from the well, an International House of Pancakes restaurant, which, funnily enough, I think I know the exact IHOP that she's thinking of here. The La Brea Tar Pits, as this place is named, can look benign like a small dark lake, one which bubbles up occasionally and smells like tires. But scientists have found more than 3 million bones trapped in the depths of these pits, including well preserved, nearly complete skeletons of massive mammals. Tar Pits Georg. How did this happen? How did thousands of the most powerful predators on the planet all get drawn into the same small pit? And why couldn't they get out? Um, now, I think me and both of my mods grew up in the LA area and probably went to the La Brea Tar Pits as children. And so we all know the answer to this question because it is like the first thing that you learn about tar pits. But it is also very, very fascinating. The La Brea Tar Pits is a living quagmire, a place where natural asphalt has been gurgling up from the ground since the last ice age. It smells terrible. I can tell you that right now. It smells so fucking bad there. What may have happened, researchers believe, is a fairly diabolical cycle. One day, tens of thousands of years ago, a large creature like an ancient bison lumbered into the tar pits. It quickly became stuck, hooves anchored in the sludge of asphalt, and began grunting in distress. It only took a few centimeters of muck to immobilize a large mammal. The bison's alarm attracted the attention of predators, like, say, the now extinct direwolf, Canis dirus, fearsome dog. Dire wolves are social animals like coyotes and humans. So a few of these wolves probably came trotting upon the scene together and naturally pounced on the trapped bison. What luck! Then the wolves themselves got stuck. And so the dire wolves howled in frustration, attracting more attention. More creatures arrived. It's a bit like the little old lady who swallowed a fly, but a different chain of causality. Eventually, the wolves died of hunger or other causes, and their rotting carcasses drew scavengers, some of whom also got stuck. The population of the doomed grew geometrically. A single carcass could remain visible for up to 5 months, attracting more unwitting victims, before finally sinking out of sight into the murky underwater crypt. To date, scientists have pulled the bones of 4,000 direwolves out of the tar pits. In his mediation work, Gary refers to conflict as a trap. That's a good description because conflict, once it escalates past a certain point, operates just like the La Brea tar pits. It draws us in, appealing to all kinds of normal and understandable needs and desires. But once we enter, we find we can't get out. The more we flail about, braying for help, the worse the situation gets. More and more of us get pulled into the muck without even realizing how much worse we are making our own lives. Just at me next time, okay? That's the main difference between high conflict and good conflict. It's not usually a function of the subject of the conflict, nor is it about the yelling. It's about the stagnation. In healthy conflict, there is movement. Questions get asked. Curiosity exists. There can be yelling too, but healthy conflict leads somewhere. It feels more interesting to get to the other side than to stay in it. In high conflict, the conflict is the destination. There is nowhere else to go. In normal life, humans make many predictable errors of judgment. In high conflict, we make many more. It is impossible to feel curious while also feeling outraged. For example, we lose access to that part of our brain, the part that generates wonder. And I will tell you, having been a person who is prone to getting into high conflict, not on my own behalf, but like on the behalf of people that I have perceived to be on the receiving end of like injustices, very, very white knight, very well justified, very like my first instinct is to like fight off the bad guys, right? And knowing that curiosity and outrage cannot coexist, fucking that alone changed my brain chemistry. I swear to God. And like, it is not always easy and it is not always my first thought, but I have found that sometimes when I am getting very intense and worked up and upset about something, if I can remind myself of this and find something to become curious about, I must maintain my whimsy. Yes, exactly. Exactly. We got to stay silly. We got to stay whimsical. We got to stay curious. We got to approach the world with wonder because and not just I wonder why you're such an asshole, but like actually, you know? Um really 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 helpful, especially in like conflict resolution and uh over the years I have ended up mediating for various people in the candy community, the crochet community, the rave scene, whatever, like the various communities that I'm part of. I sometimes end up mediating disputes, and it has been very helpful for that. All right. High conflict degrades a full life in exchange for moments of fleeting satisfaction, and the implications are physical, measurable, and punishing. When they fight, couples experience spikes in cortisol, a stress hormone, as do political partisans after their candidate loses an election. In high conflict, cortisol injections can become recurring, impairing the immune system, degrading memory and concentration, weakening muscle tissue and bones, and accelerating the onset of disease. For those of you who are just listening, I'm looking into the camera like Jim on The Office. We continue. And then there are all the people who do not actively participate in the high conflict, the bystanders. They are so distressed by the fight that they tune out altogether. And this category includes most people. About two-thirds of Americans are fed up with political polarization and wish people would spend more time listening to one another, according to the nonpartisan organization More in Common, which labeled this group the quote, exhausted majority. Now, again, this book was written in 2021. So I don't know where that currently stands, but I would be interested to find out. Also, like, interested in the actual polling methods to use to determine this because very statistically interesting, but also how do you accurately judge this? I don't know. All right, the exhausted majority. And who can blame them? Most of us avoid all kinds of conflict, often for very good reason. We eventually stop hanging out with that friend who complains incessantly about his ex wife, or we stop reading the news. We keep our heads down. This detachment is understandable, but it leaves high conflict untreated. The extremists take over. Overnight, high conflict can shapeshift into violence, as history keeps showing us. One isolated act of bloodshed leads to collective pain on the other side, and then a need for revenge. Oh, okay. Pringle is looking it up for me. The nonpartisan organization is more in common. All like capital, more capital common. And it would have been a study prior to 2021, presumably. All right. High conflict can shapeshift into violence. Need for. Yes, okay. In war, the us versus them mindset is an essential weapon. It is much easier to kill, enslave, or imprison people if you are convinced they are subhuman. This was the primordial force Gary was up against as he tried to create a new way to navigate conflict. He had successes like the one with Lorna and Jay, but it was difficult, risky work. He had to build a new boat, a kind that could skim the surface of the tar pits. Over the next 4 decades, Gary mediated some 2,000 cases this way. He got better at it over time. He handled corporate disputes, sibling feuds, neighborhood rifts, and many other unpleasant asphalt rescues. It was not until very recently that Gary got stuck in the tar pits himself. He got separated from his rescue boat for a time, as we'll see, without realizing it. And it did not go well. Mostly, though, Gary managed to move just above the surface of the muck. He came to realize that human beings have two intrinsic capacities when it comes to solving problems. One is our capacity for adversarialism, the pursuit of mutually exclusive, selfish interests by groups working against one another. This is how the legal system traditionally operates: husband versus wife, prosecution versus defense. Our other capacity, also evident throughout human history, is our instinct for solidarity, our ability to expand the definition of us and work across differences to navigate conflicts. In fact, our evolutionary success as a species has depended more on this second capacity than the first. Like, yeah, for sure. I agree with that. Also, my voice is getting a little hoarse. Gotta wet my whistle. During the first phase of the coronavirus pandemic, billions of people responded to a highly unfamiliar, ever changing threat with breathtaking cooperation and selflessness. Citizens around the world began staying home days before official stay at home orders were issued by their governments. This happened in poor countries and rich. After the UK's National Health Service put out a call asking for 250,000 volunteers to run errands for at risk people in quarantine, 3 times that many signed up. There were also exceptions: specific leaders and small numbers of regular people who scapegoated others and divided the world cleanly into us and them. But for months, the vast majority of people felt a visceral pull in the opposite direction toward collective unity. Now imagine what might have happened had more of our traditions been designed to encourage that instinct for collaboration rather than adversarialism. Institutions can be designed to incite either version of human nature, to provoke adversarialism or unity. But in modern times, we've erred on the side of adversarialism. We see everything from politics to business to the law as a contest between winners and losers. Loser. And yet, Gary and other mediation pioneers proved that there is another way. They built a non adversarial option for resolving disputes, and it usually works more efficiently and fairly than the traditional system. Even the US Supreme Court has recognized the limits of adversarialism. For many claims, trials by adversarial contests must in time go the way of the ancient trial by battle and blood, Chief Justice Warren Earl Burger said in his State of the Judiciary speech in 1984. Our system is too costly, too painful, too destructive, and too ineffective for a truly civilized people. No kidding. But alas, 1984, too late, buddy. Couldn't the same be said about politics today? It is too costly, painful, destructive, and ineffective for a truly civilized people. Yeah, for sure. What do we do? So it made a certain kind of sense when, in 2015, one of Gary's neighbors asked him to run for local office in his small town of Muir Beach. The Community Services District Board of Directors, as it is known, is in charge of area roads and water management. Its 5 members are unpaid volunteers. The board is not a particularly powerful body, and the elections are nonpartisan. But somehow the town meetings had become adversarial and draining. People were calling each other names, just like on cable news, just like on Twitter. There had been a nasty fight recently with the U.S. Park Service over the aesthetics of a proposed new bus stop, and it had nearly torn the community apart. Couldn't Gary, the godfather of mediation, help change the tone and find some peace? One would think, one would hope. But small town politics are no man's land. The Michael Jordan of conflict. This is a terrible idea, Cassidy said, for the second or maybe the third time. Gary and his 35-year-old son, Cassidy, were hiking, following an 8-mile loop near Gary's house that rambles through old growth redwood trees before breaking through to a ridge with wide open views of the Pacific. Gary's wife, Trish, had loved the idea of his running for office. She hadn't seen it as a political issue. In her mind, public office would be a gift, a natural way for him to give back to their community. Gary was 71 years old, and he'd been looking to travel less anyway, so he could spend more time with his grandchildren. This might be perfect timing. His daughter had been thrilled too. Who better to bring the community together than her dad, America's conflict guru? Cassidy was the only holdout in the family. He was now working as a documentary filmmaker, but years ago he'd been a small town reporter, and so he thought he understood things that his father didn't. Politics can be horrible, he said. Neighbors turn on neighbors. I've seen it happen. They reached the ridge and stared out at the ocean. From here, they could see all the way to the San Francisco Bay and the peak of Mount Tamalpais? Tamalpais? Don't know how to say that one. The peak of a mountain. They'd had some of their most important conversations on this trail. They'd talked decades earlier about moving as a family to France for a year. More recently, they'd talked about what it was like for Cassidy to become a father himself. Cassidy had a habit of asking Gary hard questions, which Gary appreciated. On that day, he tried to explain himself to his son. The one frustration of my mediation life is that I'm always in the middle, he said. I just sit on the sidelines. He knew politics could be toxic, but that was the point. He wanted to repair the process, to help people get underneath their conflict to what really mattered. He'd seen the political polarization dividing the country, and he recognized the pathology. He'd spent his whole life treating it. Politicians were acting like feuding families, resentful, suspicious, unable to see how they were destroying the things they once held dear. That the name calling had infected Muir Beach showed just how bad things had got. He'd helped create an alternative to the legal traditions, hadn't he? There was a time when no one had thought that could be done either. What if the model of mediation that I've been working on for so long, what if that could be applied to politics? His son looked alarmed. It sounded to Cassidy like his dad thought he could single-handedly fix politics. He might as well have said he was thinking of swan diving off the cliff in front of him. Gary could wreck his reputation and his peace of mind. And for what? The location of a bus stop? This felt familiar to Cassidy, in a bad way. He'd seen his father let his ambition get away from him before. Despite his usual humility, despite his deep knowledge of the human psyche, his dad could suffer from visions of grandeur. He was doing it again, Cassidy saw, even now, a man in his 70s letting his ego run wild. It bothered him to see this contradiction in his father and not be able to make him see it too. Maybe, Cassidy thought, he could use a sports analogy, something his dad could understand. He could appeal to the ego rather than fighting it. You have this incredible record. It's like when Michael Jordan tried to play baseball, remember? And everyone was like, don't do it. he said, the pitch of his voice rising as he spoke. Gary smiled. Cassidy tried again, this time more directly. Look at your personality. You're not a politician. You're not schmoozy. You don't even like small talk. Gary nodded. It was true. He hated superficial conversations. He didn't do pleasantries. He didn't even attend the community board meetings normally. They were tedious, he thought. But that was why he was exactly the right person for the job. Maybe I could change politics, he said, with a shrug and another smile, his wavy white hair blowing in the sea breeze. His son sighed. Then something shifted in Cassidy's expression. It was difficult to tell, but Gary thought he looked angry. It's way more likely, Cassidy said, that politics will change you. False flags. Gary's craft has evolved since Lorna and Jay's divorce. If you go to him for a divorce today, he'll invite you and your spouse to tell him the story of your marriage. He sits in the middle, in every sense of the word. He listens intently, even when the two of you start arguing. Gary's okay with arguing. He has a kind face, like the uncle you wish you had at all your family dinners, someone who knows when to laugh and when to listen. He might introduce you to his dog, a small brown mutt named Artie, who is also fine with arguing. Artie will curl up at Gary's feet and observe the proceedings in Zen like silence. When you finished your story, Gary will check to see if he's understood it. His questions might sound a little odd to someone trying to end a marriage. What is one thing you understand about your husband's view? Or what would change in your life if you got what you wanted? Gary tends to ask his questions with his head cocked to the side, eyes bright, as if he is hearing something he's never heard before. This posture communicates curiosity, which is contagious. When he does this, most people find themselves thinking before they answer. For all their years of fighting, they may never have articulated what their lives would be like if they won. Question by question, Gary helps people chip underneath layers of familiar, everyday grievances to find what they care about most. To get beyond conflict, you have to go through it. There's no other way. Say a wife makes a demand. I want $4,000 a month for spousal support. The husband recoils. That's absurd, he yells. Never gonna happen. It appears they're fighting about the money, and they are, but the more interesting conflict lies underneath this fight over money. Why $4,000? Gary asks, probing the specificity of the number. He could guess, but he tries not to. He asks this question in a quiet voice to show that he really wants to know the answer. What does that amount of money mean to you? The wife pauses. Then she reveals she's worried she won't be able to earn enough money on her own. She has this notion, this idea that she could go back to school and become a physician. A, mm, she could go back to school and become a physician's assistant. She thinks she'd be good at it, so she wants the money to help cover her normal expenses plus tuition. That's where the figure comes from. Her husband has never heard this before. Humans tend to interpret new information so that it fits into their existing beliefs, a well studied phenomenon known as confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, bane of my fucking existence, and I am super guilty of it. I have to, like, be so alert to myself, to my own confirmation biases, because it is so tempting and easy and simple and familiar to just interpret all new information through the lens of the information I already have and not be curious about the parts that I don't actually specifically have answers for already. The worse a conflict gets, the harder it is to disrupt. When the husband had initially heard the wife's request for money, he fitted into his narrative for their marriage. She was selfish and he would never get out from under her control. Gary's questions interrupted that cascade of assumptions just for a split second, which is sometimes enough. Then Gary asked the husband how he felt when he heard his wife say the number 4,000. What would it be like for you, he asks, tilting his head toward the husband, if you agreed to the $4,000? The husband sighs. He wants to quit his job, he says, which he hates. His job has kept him from being the kind of parent he wants to be. He wants to do better before their 13-year-old son grows up. He'd stayed in that suffocating position for years in order to provide for his family, and now his family is falling apart. The threat of having to pay $4,000 a month makes him feel trapped, like he's losing his past and his future. Hearing this, the wife's reaction is complicated. She'd pushed him to quit that job for years, and now he's going to do it after all this time? It's bittersweet. But once she understands what's underneath his objection to the money, she can see it for what it is. It's not just that he resents her for getting his money, it's also about his own future, his own dreams. Eventually, both people feel more understood, even as they continue to disagree about many things. At that point, Gary has found, they are able to stop defending their positions and make more thoughtful decisions about their futures and their children. And like Lorna and Jay, they will make the decisions, not a judge or some lawyers, which means they probably will not need to relitigate their conflict anytime soon. All right. We are about a minute and 45 in, and I am starting to feel some pain in my throat. So I'm going to call it here. We are partway through chapter one. If you are reading along at home, we've just gotten onto page 35 of the paperback. And thank you so much for joining me and hanging out. And thank you times 1,000,000 billion quadrillion to my mods, Rarest Pringle and Evolving Logic. Y'all fucking rock. I will be back next Tuesday, which is the 28th of October at 9:30 p.m. Central, which I am on Central Time. I actually live in Minneapolis. So the George Floyd stuff, very real to me. Um, if I feel up to it, if I end up having more time, I might add more days, more times in the future. But for now, it's just going to be Tuesdays, 9:30 p.m. Central, here on my Twitch channel. And I will figure out where to upload these, how to upload these, what the best format is, etc. But I think I will put them up for free on my Patreon to start and go from there. All right. Thanks for joining, and I will see you all next time.